Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's academic 10 o'clock, so time for us to get started here today. My name is Patrick Thaddeus Jackson. I am a professor here in the School of International Service, and I am proud to be the chair of the Department of Global Inquiry, one of the 5 new departments that FIS put together this year. And the Department of Global Inquiry has a sponsor of today's talk has a very particular brief when it comes to thinking about questions of international relations and global order. We take it as our kind of mission to really engage in the historical and contextual conceptualization of what goes on in international affairs, and to think outside the boundaries of the kind of received nation-state system and sort of Western imperial order that we've all kind of grown up in, which is why we are absolutely thrilled and delighted that our speaker for today is Dr. Julian Go, who is a leading scholar of empire and post-colonial thought. I'll tell you a little bit about him before he gets going. Julian Go is professor of sociology and director of graduate studies in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. At the university, he is also a fellow in the Center for Contemporary Theory, a faculty affiliate in the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, a member of the Committee on International Relations, and a senior fellow of the Society of Fellows in the College of Liberal Arts. Julian received his PhD in sociology and political science from the University of Michigan in 1992, his PhD in sociology from University of Chicago in the year 2000. Before moving to the Department of Sociology in the University of Chicago in 2020, he taught at the University of Illinois and at Boston University. Now, Julian's research explores the social logics, forms, and impact of empires and colonialism, post-colonial and decolonial thought, and related questions of social theory, epistemology, and knowledge. He also is a leading figure in global historical sociology. Among other things, many other things, he is the author of American Empire and the Politics of Meaning, 2008, from Duke University Press. Patterns of Empire, the British and American Empire, 1688 to Present, Cambridge University Press, 2011. And a book that my PhD students are reading for their PhD seminar this afternoon, Postcolonial Thought and Social Theory, from the Oxford University Press in 2016. His most recent book, Policing Empires, Militarization and Race in Britain and America, 1829 to Present, which he will be talking to us about today, explores imperialism's impact on police militarization in the United States and Britain. And he's also working on a project recovering anti-colonial thought as a critical form of social theory. Now, among his many awards and professional recognitions, he is the recipient of the very prestigious Louis A. Kosar Award for Theoretical Agenda Setting in Sociology, given by the American Sociological Association. And in the year 2021-2022, he served as president of the Social Science History Association, which is an organization specifically set up to promote cross-disciplinary dialogue between history and sociology. We are very excited to welcome to the podium, Dr. Julian Go.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to this new department. It's my great honor to be a part of this, and to SOLA for helping with the logistics, and to all of you for coming out. As I said, it's a great honor. So as Dr. Jackson mentioned, I will be talking about my book, but a lot of these ideas I'm still working through. So I very much welcome your trenchant critique and questions as I continue to work through this material. Now, as you'll see, as I proceed, my talk today is a work of global historical sociology, but I want to start in the present. As you all may know by now, over the past months, protests and demonstrations against the war in Gaza have been erupting all around the world. And nearly everywhere, they have been met with a heavily militarized police presence. Of course, in the Middle East itself, militarized police are used to regulate and discipline Palestinians, while the IDF mounts its operations in Palestinian territories. We saw this in late October when the Israeli border police fired gas canisters at Muslim Palestinians trying to hold Friday prayers by a road outside the old city of Jerusalem. But even in mainland Europe and in the United States, militarized police are called out to regulate pro-Palestinian protests. Back in October, the heavily armed police or gendarmerie in France faced down protesters with tear gas. In the United States, the police presence has also been felt from Los Angeles to Boston and many other cities too. Now, for many of us, none of this should be surprising, right? We've seen this militarized police presence often and repeatedly in the United States, from Ferguson in 2014 to Standing Rock in 2016, across the US, of course, during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. So for us, militarized police may not seem so surprising, but if it's not surprising for us, I think we should be puzzled. At the very least, we should be puzzled. For what is militarization after all? According to the sociologist Peter Kraska, police militarization is the process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. And crucially, it involves not just the adoption of guns and tanks, NRAPs, and so on, but also cultural, organizational, and operational aspects of the military. Ultimately, what this means is that the police bear the arms and mindsets of armies, thus readied to treat citizens as enemies of war, as foreign aggressors, even as those very citizens' taxes are what's paying for the militarized police in the first place, paying for the equipment, paying for the training, paying for their salaries. So this is puzzling, I think, both as a sociologist and it should be puzzling as a citizen. What's also puzzling, to get more academic here, is that if you know about the history of the police in the US, you know that theoretically it's not supposed to be this way. In the United States, the police follow the model of what's called the civil police. This is a model of policing that originated in Britain in the 19th century with modern policing as we know it. This was born in 1829 when a man named Sir Robert Peel created the London Metropolitan Police, which was the first professional centralized uniform police department in England. And this model of the London Metropolitan Police, the civil police, subsequently spread to the US, where cities also created their own police departments, and it spread all throughout the world. And through this process of diffusion, the civil police model by now is probably the dominant policing form in most of the world. But here again is the puzzle. The civil police model is meant to be an alternative to militarized force. Peel invented the model and implemented in England as a new state organization to fight crime and disorder without using the coercive tools of the military. He and his peers also created the new model in opposition to the other available policing model at the time, the heavily militarized police on the continent that sprung from Napoleon's conquest, such as the heavily militarized French police or the French gendarmerie. So the civil police has insinuated this bifurcation between policing and the army that we take for granted today. That is, the army is meant for violent coercion on enemies overseas, while the police is for citizens at home. This is a bifurcation that even the US Army itself articulates. Historically, says the US Army Field Manual, that the US has attempted to separate the functions of domestic law enforcement and the military, based on the different missions of the two groups and the populations they're to encounter, right? So the police are meant to protect and serve, respect the rights of offenders and victims, and resort to violence only in desperate situations. Military forces are supposed to do all these other bad things overseas. So this very insinuation, right, is an invention that emerges only with the birth of the civil police. Before this time, as I'll mention also, the army was called in to domestic territory to deal with disorder. So in this regard, the term civil police is especially fitting as a rhetorical device, as well as a conceptual label. The word civil, of course, invokes the idea of citizen, as in the police force of, by, and for citizens, rather than for foreigners, and enemies, it also summons the sense of civility, hence peace, rather than brute force. But again, the militarization of the police transgresses this original ideal, this very stated ideal of the civil police itself. So this stages my intervention, which is basically to further explore this puzzle. I want to ask a deceitfully simple question. Why is the civil police militarized? How did we get here? Right? How did we go from this ideal that was born in the 19th century to where we are today? To answer, I'll primarily talk about the United States and Britain because that's where the so-called civil police was born and propagated. I will trace out the historical origins of the modern civil police and chart what's happened over time. So this means that while at the end I will refer to the more current period, my approach is ultimately historical, but it's a historical approach that is spirited by the conviction that what is needed is an understanding of our present through an understanding of the past. So I'm here trying to propose a kind of history of the present, and more precisely, a historical sociology of our seemingly post-colonial present of militarized policing. And I really hope that those of you who aren't so historically minded, who don't think historically, can see something of the value by the end of my talk of thinking about this historically. Ultimately, I want to tell a story that I tell in the book. I want to tell a story and theorize policing in a way that differs from nearly all of the dominant existing accounts that I've seen. And it differs in several respects. I could say that I'm a full professor. I can say I'm doing something completely new, but I'm synthesizing a lot. So, but I do want to stress these points because I do think they're different. So what am I going to talk about? First, I offer a different historicization. Most accounts of policing in the US and even Britain, which is a parallel story, suggest that the civil police became militarized in recent years, right? So in this story, police militarization is something relatively new. Or, it begins in the United States, say, with the war on drugs, some people say, or the 1970s. So you had once a pristine civil police, and then it got corrupted by militarization in the past decades. By contrast, I will show that the so-called civil police in both Britain and the United States has been militarized from the very beginning of modern policing, and that this has been a sort of continual process. More precisely, from the beginning, there have been various waves of militarization historically. The second overarching claim is that these waves of militarization manifest deeper logics. These logics, as we'll see, that are not haphazard, right? I'm a social scientist, I find patterns. And they have to do with things that most accounts of policing, with some notable exceptions, have not taken seriously enough. That is empire and the global color line. As we'll see, to understand police militarization, and I'd argue the very essence and character of policing today, we need to understand policing's deep racialized imperiality, or put differently, its coloniality. And what I'll ultimately argue is that this concept, police militarization, is obfuscating. It's probably not the best word for what's been going on. What I really want us to realize is that police militarization is better thought of as an effect of the Imperial Boomerang. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to go through these points through some historical examples, bringing us to the present. And I want to start where it all began with the London Metropolitan Police, which was established in 1829. To understand this organization, you really have to understand its novelty. And then to understand its novelty, you have to understand that before 1829, we did not have policing departments as we know them today. Neither England nor the United States had police. The word police, in fact, did not even refer to a police department. It rather referred to an act or function of the government, and it often referred to acts of regulating the economy, not crime, right? As in Adam Smith's use of the policing concept. There were no police departments as we know them today to deal with crime. All of England and the United States had a motley array of watchmen and local parish constables, many of whom were part-time, volunteer, or paid by fees. To deal with social disorder, the state had to call in the army. If there were demonstrations or unruly strikes or riots, they had to call in the army. Now, the new police changed all of that. It brought a centralized, full-time, professionalized, uniformed police that was tasked with tackling crime and regulating public order at once. And again, this is why it's apt to refer to the police as the civil police. It was meant to replace the army. Peel, who founded it, said expressly, this is to replace the army. We don't have to call in the army anymore. It was meant to be a force of civilians under civilian control. And this is the police that other cities then emulated. After London, Liverpool, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, this is just some of them, some of the first ones, created their own police departments. Then came the United States. Savannah was the first in the South to create its police department, and so on, and it spread all around. So why would I refer to this as a kind of militarization? Well, as I have already mentioned, on the one hand, the London police and the US police after that was meant to be an alternative to the military. Calling in the army in England to deal with strikes and riots was not a good thing. Politicians really got tired of it. There was violence, of course. The strike at Peterloo led to deaths, right, by the army. And so it was really politically tainted to continually call in the army. And so something had to be done because there was this perceived rise in strikes and disorder. And one of the officials who founded the new police was this man, as I mentioned, Sir Robert Peel, who was the Home Secretary of Britain at the time. And one of the solutions he came up with was to create a French-style gendarmerie, a heavily militarized police. The problem was that Peel knew that this wasn't going to fly any better than the army, right? This was a heavily militarized police, and the British at the time, of course, if there's one thing they despised, no more than it was the French and French despotism and Napoleon. So, Peel knew this was not going to work with the middle classes and the upper classes. So Peel had to create something new. He had to invent something different, something between the dreaded military or gendarmerie on the one hand and nothing at all, no coercive force at all. And so the solution was this civil police, something separate from the military, but nonetheless available to and powerful enough to manage disorder and criminal activity. So in this sense, it was supposed to be an alternative to the military, but here's where we come to militarization. While the new police was indeed crafted as an alternative to the army, it was militarized. The new police, in fact, borrowed not so much from the military per se, but more precisely from colonial forms of control, colonial forms of coercion. Now, it's commonly noted that Peel, who founded the new police in England, had had colonial experience. He, in fact, had previously served as Chief Secretary of Ireland, essentially its governor, right? And Ireland at the time was more or less a colony of Britain. And Peel, in Ireland, got a lot of experience with colonial forms of coercion. And he helped, in fact, devise some of these forms. And he took those forms as an inspiration for this new police. You have to understand, in Ireland, even prior to 1829, as in all other colonies, the colonial state had to develop all forms of violent, coercive apparatuses, right? Violent forces to suppress insurrection, suppress crime from the colonized populations. And in the colonies, the line between crime and insurrection was always blurry. So in Ireland, right, there had been the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which was an armed urban insurgency force, whose duties were to exactly control both crime and manage public disorder. Then in 1814, over a decade before Peel created the London Metropolitan Police, he created what was called the Peace Preservation Force to cover some of the rural districts. And his Peace Preservation Force merged with the 1822 Irish Constabulary, later renamed the Royal Irish Constabulary. Again, colonial forms, counterinsurgency forces, heavily militarized. In fact, the constabulary's officers were all veterans of the army. The structure of the force followed the army's hierarchy. The constabulary were regularly drilled and trained in military methods. They were heavily armed, bearing pistols and bayoneted carbines. They were housed in barracks to be called out as needed and distributed across the countries, which were divided up into policing districts. So again, these were colonial counterinsurgency forces, tools of the colonial state, meant to do what? To suppress anti-colonial unrest and insurgencies across the territory. And these colonial forces formed a large part of the inspiration behind the London Metropolitan Police. Peel, in fact, simply transferred them to English soil. So, for example, the very structure of the London police was modeled after the colonial forces in Ireland. The Irish constabulary had been centralized in the hands of civilian officials, and in fact, in Peel himself, sitting in Dublin Castle to call out the police when needed. So too was the command and control of the London Metropolitan Police centralized in the Home Office to be directed by Peel too, because at the time, Peel was Home Secretary. And just as Peel's constabulary in Ireland had been organized along military lines with officers, non-commissioned officers and men, so did Peel structure the London police in the same way. In fact, Peel insisted that the new London police be commanded by commissioners, not just with military experience, but more precisely with experience in Ireland. One of those first commissioners was this man, Sir Charles Rowan, an Englishman who had served in Ireland and in the military. And in turn, Rowan laid out the basic operations for the police, drawing upon his own colonial experience and knowledge of colonial regimes. And many of these innovations that he created are still with us today. And so this is the basis of our modern policing system. For instance, one of the things that Rowan did was structure the force according to a military hierarchy. Now, today we take it completely for granted that our police is centralized and hierarchically ordered with titles like sergeants. But Rowan structured this for the first time as a military hierarchy, where beneath him were a series of officers, including 16 sergeants, a title taken directly from the army. The new force was also uniformed, just as the army was. This, to be clear, was new. The constables and watches had not been uniformed. The color of the uniform was blue rather than the army's red, but notably the Dublin Metropolitan Police had also worn blue uniforms, and many of the senior officers were taken directly from the military. On top of this, the entire system of police patrol had a colonial inspiration. The City of London was divided into police divisions to be patrolled by constables according to a beat system. Has anyone heard of the beat system? Beat patrol, right? Again, take it for granted. Where did it come from? Well, it's a system where, of course, the policemen of each section were assigned to a specific territory or a beat where they're to walk around and survey. The beats extended to 13 kilometers and were meant to be covered by foot in 20 minutes. But essentially, the London police originated this, but it came from colonial experiences. It was essentially a mingling of two colonial models of coercion. First, it took from the slave patrols that had originated in the British Caribbean and the Carolinas and in the American South. These, for those of you who don't know, had been created for inspecting slave dwellings for arms or illicit goods, disrupting any large gatherings of slaves, hunting fugitives, and generally keeping slaves in line. The slave patrols had also been organized militarily, and they had been organized into territories, distinct territories that they were each to survey. What were they called? They were called beats. The Met's new beat system combined this system with the British Army's new light infantry units. These were highly mobile counterinsurgency units that Charles Rowan's commander in the army, Sir John Moore, had developed and used against slave rebels in St. Lucia in the 1790s. They were also deployed in 1798 to rout the Irish insurgents during the 1798 rebellion. Light infantry were also essentially what Peel's Peace Preservation Force and the Irish Constabulary were also, highly mobile, small units, utilizing open order formations rather than close order formations, where soldiers line up in a line and they basically shoot at the enemy and they're both lined up in line. Very silly. The new set of military operations where they divide up into these small mobile units. And so these colonial operations were what informed Rowan's beat system. Assigned distinct territories that they were to cover, the new police patrol surveyed populations as slave militia patrols surveyed slave populations in their territories, and as the patrols were meant to be flexible so that they could move across the city swiftly as the situation demanded, and mutually supporting, coming to the aid of other patrols when necessary. The beat patrols also mimicked Moore's light infantry, and with them, Peel's Preservation Force, the Irish Constabulary. So there's a lot of details here. What I'm getting at is that this new London Metropolitan Police, all the way down, was not only militarized, but it was borrowing from, more precisely, colonial regimes of coercion. And this is why I think that the term police militarization is not as precise as it should be, right? What we really have with the London Metropolitan Police is the coloniality of policing. While police militarization is just about appropriating military tools and practices generally, the coloniality of policing highlights the appropriation of the tools, technologies, and tactics and mindsets developed and deployed at the frontiers of empire to violently repress deviance and disorder from racialized peoples deemed other and inferior. And so to make sense of this, I go beyond the standard literature that you might find on militarization and looks for other conceptual tools. And I basically enlist anti-colonial thinkers. For what the coloniality of policing alerts us to is that militarization is essentially a product of imperial feedback, or the boomerang effect, as I like to think of it. This is where the tools of empire overseas come home, they're brought back for domestic use. Now, let me just dwell on this for a second to get into some of the conceptual territory. If you read Foucault in his lectures in the 1970s at the Collège de France, titled "Society Must Be Defended," you'll see that Foucault alludes to this boomerang effect in one of the rare, if not only, moments that Foucault actually acknowledges colonialism exists. He says, it should never be forgotten that while colonization with its techniques and its political and juridical weapons obviously transported European models to other continents, it also had a considerable boomerang effect on mechanisms of power in the West. Hannah Arendt, interestingly, also spoke of the boomerang effect in reference to British colonialism and Germany. Overseas colonialism, Arendt says in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, basically contained the seeds for totalitarianism in Europe. But in fact, before Foucault, and even I think before Arendt, the term colonial boomerang effect was used by this man, Aimé Césaire. Césaire used the term to characterize Hitler's violent invasion and rule of neighboring European countries, claiming that what Hitler was doing in Europe was simply the importation of the violent processes and racist practices of European colonialism abroad. And so this process, this return of the boomerang I'm suggesting, is what directly shaped modern policing in Britain from its very birth. This is why I say we need to think of policing, militarized policing, as a boomerang effect. It's an appropriation of colonial tools of coercion, the domestication of tools developed overseas to come home. Now, there's an aspect to this conceptualization, something that, in fact, I don't think Césaire properly thinks about, or even Foucault or Arendt, when they talk about the boomerang effect. And that is the historical conditions under which the boomerang comes home. Why would the boomerang come home? Imperialism, colonialism have been ongoing processes, right? But there are only moments when the boomerang comes home. And what I want to suggest is that going beyond the literature on the boomerang effect, we might enlist someone like Stuart Hall. For those of you who know Stuart Hall's work, and think about the racialized logics that bring the boomerang home. And here we can get closer to this, an answer for the question, why is it that the civil police are militarized? Let me explain. Well, if we go back to the London case, according to existing historiography, if you pick up the books and read about historians' discussion of why why Peel created the police, they'll all say that, well, there was a rise in crime, there was a rise in disorder with workers' strikes and threats of insurrection and so on, and so we needed a new police. That's true, but what most of these historiographies don't mention is that these sort of threats to crime and order that threats to law and order that Peel and others began to perceive, that these threats were racialized. What Peel and other officials were responding to when they created the police was not so much crime and order in general, but rather the specific perceived threat posed by colonized peoples who had been migrating to England's urban centers. And of course, this meant the Irish. The Irish had been coming to England for as long as English rule had begun, but the early 1800s, just before the birth of the new police, saw heightened migration to England, even before the so-called, Irish famine. The new union, as never before, facilitated England's colonization of Irish agriculture, a process of dispossession which ejected thousands of destitute Irish subjects, producing a veritable colonial reserve army of the unemployed. At the same time, the rising cotton manufacturing and shipping industries, when England was beginning to industrialize based upon its textile industry, this rising cotton manufacturing and shipping industries required more cheap labor. And the Irish eventually filled the gap. In England, the numbers of Irish rose from 40,000 in the late 1700s to 590,000 by 1831. And this rapid influx of Irish fueled all kinds of anxieties among the English, who began complaining about the influx of Irish hordes, fueling long-standing processes of racialization. The Irish were increasingly seen as fundamentally foreign, unalterably alien, and incorrigibly inferior. This is the early 1800s, so scientific racism hadn't fully taken hold, but references to Irish biology, blood, and stock increased in this period, if you read the discourse, mingling with cultural explanations of Irish inferiority. Stark differentiation between Irish workers and English workers followed, as countless so-called experts and officials and employers claimed that the Irish were physically predisposed to certain types of labor, were less civilized, more disorderly than English, and more violent than English workers. And this, of course, justified their low pay and their low position in the occupational hierarchy. The Irish, in short, were the racialized sub-proletariat of England's rising economy. And what all of this meant is that when Peel and other police reformers, beginning in the 1820s through the 1830s, spoke about needing a new police to deal with rising crime and disorder, the Irish were, in fact, their implicit and often explicit reference point. They saw the Irish as inherently lawless and criminal, and most officials blamed the Irish for the seeming increase in crime. They also connected Irish migrants to the increased potential for uprisings in London and workers' strikes around the manufacturing districts of the country. In the English mind, of course, the Irish were inherently disorderly and violent. This perceived racial threat was what had compelled the creation of those colonial forces in the first place, right? And now in the 1820s, what was going on? Well, to the English mind, the barbarians were at the gates. English officials made analogies between colonized subjects in Ireland and the Irish migrants coming to England, and they made analogies between the colonial situation of criminality, uprising, and revolt in Ireland and the situation in London. In fact, as many migrant Irish had been joining the growing worker rebellions across the country, they were seen as not only at the gates, but as flooding through them. In 1828, a periodical blamed crime on the Irish, while also predicting outright rebellion, claiming that the Irish conspirators of 1798, this rebellion, were sending their men to England to incite English workers and were acting as the Guy Fawkesites of Ireland, plotting to make, quote, a glorious bonfire of London. Even Black radicals were added to the threat, as the press seized upon the fact that William Cuffey, an English worker of African origin, had become a leading figure in the Chartist movement, this workers' movement. The London press complained that the London Chartist workers' movement was illegitimate because it wasn't, in fact, a workers' English movement, but essentially an Irish movement led by an African. In short, the formation of the London police in 1829 was not so much a response to crime and disorder in general, nor a response to workers in general. This is my argument with Marxist historiography, but rather in response to the so-called Irish problem. And it's fitting to deal with this Irish problem. Peel and Rowan and other police reformers created the new police, and it's fitting that they modeled it after Ireland's colonial forces. While they certainly hoped to manage rising crime and disorder, also on their mind was the need to manage the thousands of colonized peoples invading their putatively sacred metropolitan spaces. The racialization of crime and disorder thus brought the Boomerang home to militarize the police. And so, if you look at the arrests by ethnicity that the London Metropolitan Police made after they were instituted, you see disproportionality of Irish arrests to population, like the same kind of disproportionalities you'll see today with non-white people and arrests. So look, this is the founding of the London Metropolitan Police. In other cities across England that I look at, Manchester, Bristol, Liverpool, you see the same story, right? Largely because these were also where the Irish were. You also see the same thing in the United States. In my book, I discuss the founding of the new police in New York City in 1844, which was the first city in the US to fully replace its constable watch system with a civil police. You also see the same story in Savannah, which was the first southern city in the US to create a civil new police. And there the Irish were also involved. Irish had been coming over to Savannah to do what? To help unload and store all the cotton being picked by Black slaves to ship to Manchester, where their Irish brethren was shipped to Liverpool, where the Irish brethren unloaded it, and then went to Manchester, where they spun the cotton into gold. And in Savannah, you had Irish populations living with African populations in the city, and it caused all kinds of perceived trouble. I can talk more about those at the end, but I want to, before I head towards a conclusion, I want to talk about one more example so that we come a little bit closer to the present, and we come a little bit closer to the United States. And I want to talk just very briefly about policing in the United States in the early 20th century. After these new police departments were formed in the United States, modeled after the Metropolitan Police, what you had in the early 20th century was a new kind of moment in policing history. And again, if you look at the policing textbooks, you'll see that what they call this period is the reform movement or the modernization movement, or they sometimes call it the professionalization movement. What had happened was, when the police departments were formed, they had been created across US cities, but in the early 20th century, all kinds of new developments unfolded. Police departments became more professionalized. They instituted brand new training programs. They expanded their capabilities. They developed new methods of criminal identification, such as fingerprinting, which also has colonial origins. They developed various specialized mobile squads to extend their reach. Whereas most patrolmen did their beats in the 19th century, just walking around, one of the many developments of this period was that police departments added mounted patrols using horses and bicycles and later motorcycles or cars in order to deploy rapidly and cover more territory. This is the mounted police squad in New York City. This was also a kind of new development. So basically what happened in this period is that police developed all these modern capabilities that we know of when we think about modern policing today. But this too was a boomerang effect. One of the leaders of this reform movement across the United States was this man. His name is August Vollmer. Now, he was chief of police at Berkeley starting in 1905, and he was the one who innovated most of these new police innovations, from mounting patrolmen to setting up the first police training school and using new records and criminal identification systems. Vollmer's known for all these things. If you look at any police textbook, you'll see he's known. And if you talk to, I think I've talked to a lot of police officers, 90% of them, if I say, do you know August Vollmer? They say, yeah, he's the father of modern policing, because he instituted all these reforms and did all these things. He went down to LA and reformed the LA department. He went to Chicago. He had developed training programs all across the country. He was a consultant and so on. And all of these innovations were more or less developed in California and at Berkeley at the time when he was police chief. Now, the question, of course, when I came across Vollmer and I noticed that he is the father of modern policing and he had all these innovations that he began at Berkeley, I asked, what's going on in Berkeley? Why Berkeley? What's going on there? Well, one of the answers lies in Vollmer's own past. Vollmer had previously served in America's imperial regime. Before he became police chief, he had served in America's largest colony at the time, the Philippines. For those of you who don't know, the US, just a reminder, had defeated the Spanish during the Spanish-American War in 1898, and then took the Philippines as its largest colony. Filipinos resisted, leading to the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902, but then which continued through various insurgencies across the period. But Vollmer had been involved in all of this. He had been in the US Army, fought Spain in the Philippines. Then as part of the American occupying force in Manila, he was among the few soldiers charged with policing the city of Manila. After this, Vollmer joined the Americans' counterinsurgency efforts against the Filipino insurgents. He had, in fact, been handpicked to join a new elite counterinsurgency unit charged with penetrating the interior to conquer and capture rebel leaders. This is a picture of the unit. Vollmer's papers, that arrow is Vollmer in the corner. There's a whole sort of colonial trope going on here with the kids and the white saviors we can talk about later. But this is he's a colonial military, and he comes back to the United States to become chief of police at Berkeley and then begin instituting these reforms. And he brought these colonial and military tactics with him. His idea of mounting forces, for instance, partly came from the Americas' counterinsurgency efforts in the interior of the Philippines, where they had developed these mounted units. He also borrowed intelligence methods from the U.S. Army's counterinsurgency efforts to gather data and intelligence on Filipino insurgents, creating little cards for each Filipino and suspected insurgent, and filing them and collecting all this information. The best example I like to use is pin mapping. Now, Vollmer is known as the innovator to come up with pin mapping and to make it popular in American police departments. What's pin mapping? Well, essentially, they would collect data on where crimes occurred. They would put up a map of the city and put pins where the crimes had occurred, and then they could see clusters of crime, and then he would deploy his mounted forces to those areas. This, for example, is from Vollmer's papers. He did the same with criminal residents, and this is Los Angeles. And this is actually a common technique today. In the 1980s, something called predictive policing emerged, using all kinds of fancy computer algorithms. It's exactly the same thing, it's just using computers. It's called spot mapping. The New York City department, right? This is a spot map of crime, right? Where you can pinpoint crime and deploy your forces. That's why it's called predictive policing. But Vollmer invented this technique, and he got it from his days in the Philippine-American War. The U.S. Army had been innovating pin mapping techniques to track the movements of Filipino insurgents, locate their camps in the vast terrain of central Luzon, and embark upon their search and destroy missions. Vollmer simply added this tactic to policing. He referred to it as the art of making war on the map. As he later explained to police officers, ever since the Spanish-American War days, I've studied military tactics and used them to good effort in rounding up crooks, right? We're conducting a war. No accident when you look at the discourse of policing in this period, this is where you first see the war on crime as a phrase emerge. It takes off after World War I, of course, but it begins with Vollmer. And in fact, other police forces brought back much more than pin mapping or mounted police units. In the 1910s and 1920s, some police across the country were soon discovered to be using torture to extract confessions. The torture was called the water cure. This is an early variant of waterboarding. Police extracted confessions from suspects by holding them down and pouring water down their throats. This too was an effect of empire. It was the chosen mode of torture used by the U.S. Army in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. It was also reportedly used by U.S. forces in the 1910s during America's long occupation of Haiti. So again, the colonial boomerang at work, and again, racial logics are at work. I just want to clarify what's going on with the racial logics that brought these as boomerang home. One of the things, if you remember from your history books, in the early 20th century, cities across the country saw an influx of new immigrants, right? In the Midwest and the East, for example, European immigrants were arriving to work in new numbers. You had the beginnings of African-American migration from the South to the North. In the South itself, more and more African-Americans were heading from the countryside to the cities, leading some of the forerunners in my Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago to begin to theorize all the crime that happens when Blacks leave their natural habitat of the plantation and come to the cities, right? So this criminology emerges partly as a result. In the West, where Vollmer was, Asian exclusion acts had slowed the influx of Chinese or Japanese, but illegal immigration continued, and many Asians migrated internally, moving across the region, heading into cities as well. Of course, to many white officials, these new immigrants and migrants were not the most welcoming sight. They claimed that it brought a rise in crime and a decay in public morality, and the specter of lawlessness and disorder, such as with this image of the Chinese. Crime and disorder was racialized again. And in the eyes of authorities, a more powerful police was the way to deal with it. And more specifically, using the tactics from the colonies was the best way to deal with it. After all, those colonies were also filled with peoples racialized as inferior, as morally suspect, as having inherent tendencies towards vice and disorder. And so for these white officials, it was perfectly appropriate and logical to import colonial methods for the purposes of domestic policing. In fact, it was by this very racialized logic that August Vollmer had been chosen to become police chief in the first place at Berkeley. Previously in Berkeley and the neighboring Oakland community, there had been fears about the increase of Chinese migrants from elsewhere across California. They had been especially appalled at the Chinese gangsters and their so-called opium dens that had been purportedly corrupting white morality and, worse yet, young white women. They therefore urged Vollmer to become police chief exactly because of experience in the Philippines, where he had already dealt with the Oriental race. Filipinos were considered Oriental at the time. The American scientists and their race science had no idea how to classify Filipinos. It caused all kinds of anxiety. They just said, oh, they're all Oriental. According to a newspaper account at the time, Vollmer's friends said to him about the job, "It will be a fighting job for whoever takes it, this job of police chief. That's why we want you, Gus." August. You were a pretty good fighting man when you went up against those goo-goos over in the island. Goo-goos was the term used by American soldiers to refer to Asians and Filipinos. Again, the boomerang comes home due to perceived racialized threats. So let me head towards a conclusion. First, just a couple points. I've only covered, of course, 2 waves or moments of the Imperial Boomerang in the US and Britain. There have been many more in the book. I go through a whole series of them. In the United States, for instance, the next wave, I think after Vollmer, happened in the late 1950s. Colonial and military forces around the imperial world had fully developed these military-style mobile police units. These were called tactical units, meant to police and squash insurgencies among colonized populations. They made their way back to the US and Britain. In New York, for instance, they created the Tactical Patrol Force. As I discussed in my book, this was created in response to a perceived racialized crime wave led by Puerto Rican and Black gangs in New York. Another tactical unit is more well-known. It was called Special Weapons and Tactics, first formed in the Los Angeles Police Department during the 1960s, of course. These were also inspired by colonial and military units. They also emerged in response to racialized threats. One of the founders of the Los Angeles SWAT unit was Daryl Gates, and he and the other founders created the new units in response to the ghetto riots of Watts, Detroit, and Newark. Gates, in fact, had referred to those riots by African Americans as guerrilla warfare, thereby making powerful analogies between America's city streets and the anti-colonial rebellions going on at that very moment across the colonized world. And so in response, Nelson, Gates, and their colleagues turned to the military, and they specifically turned to the Army's special elite counterinsurgency units that had been deployed in Vietnam. As a result, they created the first SWAT unit in the country, after which, of course, departments all around the United States developed their own SWAT units. And of course, since that time, the boomerang effect has continued almost unceasingly. In recent years, for instance, veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have advised law enforcement or even served as police officers themselves. What some have been trying to do is use counterinsurgency techniques from Iraq and deploy them in order to police gangs and minority neighborhoods. They've been working with the police to develop technologies and tactics and procedures taken from the military, like new computer algorithms, surveillance software, and using social network theory, resulting in the construction of the so-called gang databases or gang matrices, many of which had been provided by companies like Palantir, which makes the software platforms for these counterinsurgency policing projects and also for the military. And we see the same logic of racialization and importation at work as these veterans turned police officers justify the use of these techniques on the grounds that gangs are like insurgents and insurgents are like gangs, using this very terrible social network theory and this bad sociology of gangs. They had no idea how gangs work. They're just using this theory. There are also connections with the Israeli state in Palestine. Since the early 2000s, at least, police officers and police chiefs from across various towns, from San Bernardino, Orlando, Haverhill, Massachusetts, these tiny towns, have traveled to Israel to observe and learn about so-called counterterrorism from the Israeli military and Israeli National Police. They've gone, for instance, to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the border with Syria, and Israel's Municipal Police Academy to learn about intelligence gathering and tactics such as roadblocks, among other things. And the process has come back to haunt some police departments recently. In January of last year, police in the city of Memphis brutally killed 29-year-old Tyree Nichols, and it was soon revealed that some of the Memphis police had previously trained with the Israel National Police. It's not necessarily a causal relationship, but it is telling of how still today there's a continued circulation of racialized policing power that extends beyond the United States and can sometimes return. And indeed, it is telling that the US police have gone to Israel to train and then return to not only police minority neighborhoods in the US, but also police the protests calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, which is how I began this talk. Melvin Laird, the US Secretary of Defense in the administration of President Nixon, once referred to Israel as America's cop on the beat, serving to represent America's interest in policing the region. And it would thus seem that that beat cop has also, in a sense, come home. So finally, my concluding point. Let me refer to this puzzle with which I began. As noted, the civil police is theoretically for protecting citizens. Therefore, police should indeed be peaceful, should be civil. The military colonial police, meanwhile, are aimed at repressing ostensibly inferior subjects and enemies, and thereby warranted to employ uncivil tools, right? Violent militaristic methods. But the militarization of policing through the boomerang effect means that these boundaries are transgressed, right? Citizens are treated like colonial subjects. But why? How is it that the so-called civil police have come to treat citizens as if they are enemies and colonial subjects, using the same means and methods that they use on the latter? Well, now that we understand the boomerang effect and the coloniality of policing, I think the answer is plain. The civil police adopt militaristic colonial modes of coercion on citizens and treat those citizens like colonial subjects because police see citizens as colonial subjects. And the primary modality for this categorical transformation, the key social code by which this miraculous transubstantiation of citizens into subjects occurs, is racialization. For by racialization, citizens are constructed to be inferior, dangerous, violent, just like colonized peoples. They are seen as subhuman specters, the dark criminal, the dark colonial subject, who encapsulate the white public's feverish fantasies of fear and horror. Racialization thus transfigures citizens into, as Akil Membe puts it in a different context, a menacing object from which one must be protected or escape, or which must simply be destroyed if it cannot be subdued. And this in turn not only warrants, but demands the importation of militarized tools, tactics, and technologies that had been originally deployed on colonized peoples abroad in the first place. Our very racialized image of the criminal, I'd argue, thus has colonial roots. Just as white settler colonial populations constructed colonized peoples as inherently violent and criminal due to their racial status, thereby warranting militarized policing in the colonies, so too do white publics and officials in America's cities today call for and justify militarized policing of Black and brown populations based upon racialized assumptions of the latter's supposedly inherent criminal tendencies and inherent violent tendencies. Last point, I promise, and then I'll shut up. I'm here hoping that this story of militarized policing mounts a larger claim about our modern present. The claim is by now perhaps banal to some, but I think it's worth reiterating. That is that our modern present is not separate from the history of colonialism. That the operations and logics of power to which we are subjected are not distant from those that empire created. Empire has been constitutive of modernity, both in its peripheral and metropolitan forms, in our streets. And if we are to apprehend our present, we must reckon with the constitutive character of imperialism upon it. Reckoning in this case, in particular, with the fact that modern forms of social control and violence in the metropole are born from colonial conquest and its racialized logics. a parallel in power that these quotes and many others index. Here, of course, Fanon is talking about French colonialism in Vietnam. But let me put it somewhat differently. That is to say that colonialism and empire, their modes of power, their mechanisms of control, their regimes of justification and legitimation have been foundational for our metropolitan modernity, constitutive of the police power in the streets of New York, Chicago, Ferguson, or DC, constitutive of our colonial modern present. And one of the mechanisms by which this has happened is through the magic of racialization, generating in the end a modern policing regime in the United States and Britain that duplicates both the forms and functionalities of policing in the colonies and peripheries of empire. In other words, it's not just that the police in the US and Britain are militarized, it's that there's been an actually existing convergence in the form and function between the policing of subjects abroad and the policing of citizens at home. It's not that policing, and this is my final point, it's not that policing is like colonialism. I think we can say policing is colonialism. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that stimulating talk. We have some time now for questions and answers. Alice, do we have a microphone on that one? We have 2 floor mics set up, and that's mostly for the folks who are listening on the live stream, because the sound in here is actually pretty good. But we do ask, if you have a question, if you can move up to one of those microphones. I'm going to take my computer and monitor the online chat, and there's some questions that are coming in there, and we'll ask them to Julian. Julian, I'll just ask you to make sure your microphone is on there, so that we can hear the responses on Zoom. So we've got about half an hour for our conversation. Why don't you start us off, Malini?
Thank you so much, Dr. Go. That was absolutely riveting, brilliant, and so timely. And so important to talk about the boomerang effect, not only as a one-off, but continuing to boomerang around the world, right? So my name is Malini Ranganathan. I'm an associate professor in SIS. Your work is in such compelling conversation with Stuart Schrader's work, Badges Without Borders, in which he argues that this sort of anti-communist imperial impulse of the US state and police, right, was very much at play in the way in which US police trained in South Vietnam and other places with communist insurgencies, and then brought that back home to suppress Black uprisings and civil rights movement. And so there is a through line between the coloniality of policing in the early 20th century and the anti-communism of policing in the mid-20th century, and the continued imperialism and racism of policing across that time period into the present. So I was wondering if you could make some connections also between the sort of, the sort of class warfare, really, that policing is. I mean, which of course a paradox is a lot of the police force comes from working class backgrounds, right? It was the route for the Irish into whiteness, for instance, in New York. So there's some real interesting paradoxes at play, but it is a form of class warfare apart from being colonialism.
Thank you so much for that question. That's great. So yeah, Stuart's work is great, very inspiring, covers the post-war period and this anti-communist dynamics. So I think the larger problematic is really the way I think about it as class and race. There's no doubt that police have used these militarized tactics on the working class. It goes back to from the very beginning, right? Breaking strikes and so on. When I started this project, I was expecting to find that the police imported these tools in response to the working class, because that's what the Marxist historiography told me. And, card-carrying Marxist, I'll admit. So I was assuming that. I didn't find that. What I found is that they were first responding to racialized subjects, not the white working class. And what I think happens is that these tools, we have to keep in mind, are imported, but they're modular. Once they're snuck in, they can be used on anybody. And so I think that's what happened in the early 20th century, for example, in the United States. Vollmer brings these tools in, changes police departments, and police departments are just proportionally using them on racialized populations, and then the worker strikes erupt, the wobblies, and then they can use them on workers. So I think race is the Trojan horse in which militarized policing has been snuck in. That's not to say class isn't important. Class is important in two ways. One, of course, they get used disproportionately in the working class. And secondly, this group, these racialized group, they are a social class. They're subproletariat, I would argue, but they have to be distinguished from the white working class because the white working class historically distinguished themselves from it. So there's a class and race story, but it's nuanced and a little more complicated. But I certainly don't want to question the idea that policing is an institution that is fundamentally a kind of class warfare. Thank you.
So I just had
If I could just ask you to go to the microphone so that people can hear you on Zoom, that'd be great.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for talking to us. That was really fascinating and really enlightening to learn about your expertise and all of that. So I had a question. I actually just moved back to DC from London, so it's very interesting to learn about a different sort of side of the Metropolitan Police that they don't always talk about when you live there. My question is, with regards to the notions of, as the professor over there mentioned, class warfare and racialization of policing, how would you, I'm curious of a connection that you might make or an opinion or analysis you might give based on the notion of the racialization of policing and possibly the rise of the far right and increasing xenophobia in Europe in the last 10, 15 years?
Thank you very much. So when I travel to Europe and Britain, you know, what people are talking about is the increasing militarization of policing in those places as well. In Europe, it's different because, you know, they've always been very sort of militarized, inherited from this French gendarmerie model, but there's more aggression and there's definitely more racial disproportionality. And this is past 10, 15 years. And of course, what everyone says, including the police officials, is that this is necessary because of all the refugees and migrants, right? So it's on one level, and I don't want to be reductive because I think it requires more study, and I would urge any PhD students out there to take a closer look at this. But I would hypothesize, based upon what I understand of other contexts, that there's been this kind of wave of militarization in response to a racialized threat, typically going under the threat of, you know, the image of counterterrorism or the label of counterterrorism, but it is a racialized threat, and you begin to see racialized disproportionalities. In London, it's a little bit different, but the racialized disproportionalities in police arrests and stopping is high, right? Actually, police murders of non-whites in Britain is higher than in the US. The numbers are much smaller, of course, but there's actually, the rate is higher. So I would hypothesize that this is, one response is the far right to the perceived threat of new immigrants. And there's all kinds of reasons to that far right response and xenophobic response. But there's a police response too, also. And I would wonder if the rise in new militarized policing past decades is, in a sense, the right's counterpoint. It's not its counterpoint, but it's concomitant as a response to these new racialized threats to the economy, threats to citizenship, threats to this social order that is imagined as usually a white social order, particularly in Europe.
Yep.
Thank you for your question.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for your talk this morning, which was really interesting. I'm a historian of the modern US and particularly of US foreign relations. And one thing that people often write about when examining, say, the US presence in the Philippines is the way in which those practices were founded on US efforts to consolidate and suppress Native Americans in the North American continent. And particularly given the image that you have on the screen right now, I just wonder if you could talk about if you saw evidence of the sort of earlier antecedents also shaping US policing practices.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So the story of settler colonialism in the United States and the way in which it shapes policing is not something I touched upon here. It's in the book. What you see in the South in Savannah with the first police departments is that those police departments are armed from the get-go. We tend to forget New York City police wasn't armed at the beginning. Savannah was armed at the get-go, from the get-go. Charleston armed from the get-go, mounted horses from the beginning. And this was taken from the slave patrol inspiration and settler colonial experiences where mounted forces had been used by the infantry, and many of the infantry, some of the infantry members come back to help shape policing. So there's a story of a boomerang effect, but a settler colonial story. So you're exactly right. And that's just not something I talked about, but it is part of the story, particularly, I think, for the Southern police departments. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Super enlightening. I am from Portland, Oregon, and I was there during 2020 when the US government brought in the National Guard, and there were a lot of riots and stuff like that. I was kind of in the mix and all that. And then I was in DC at the end of 2020 when the entire like White House and everything was blocked off, and there were like tanks in the streets. And so we really saw like the United States like waving its big stick in our faces. And when that movement was happening, one point that was kind of being emphasized over and over again, and kind of the point of your talk is that like policing has not really failed. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And so that leads me to ask, like, where do you kind of see this going? Like, what are the alternatives to policing? As you know, we're trying to imagine where there was a world before like 200 years ago where policing was not a thing. So of course there can be a world where it no longer exists, but I think it's just hard for me to picture that when I witnessed all of that like right in front of my eyes.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. It gets at the heart of the question. My first answer is that I'm a historical sociologist, so I don't have to answer any hard questions about what to do now. But I will. I'll try to. And here I'm just thinking with and learning from activists on the street and the people I've talked to and other scholars. I'd say two things. One, when I started this project, I was just interested in colonialism and policing. It really started after 2014, and I noticed all these similarities between militarized policing and colonialism. And I started reading through this police literature, talking to police scholars, and I had no idea that I would actually become an abolitionist, but I've become an abolitionist. When I started out, I didn't even know what that meant. I've become that way because I think two things. One lesson of the story is that policing is not sometimes racialized and sometimes militaristic, all the way down, right, from the very beginning. That's the structure of the institution. So you can't train it away, right? You can't just disarm the police. You still have the military structures. You can't do 3 hours of bias training and get rid of these deeply ingrained racialized assumptions, which even non-white officers share, and that the public shares, that we share, right? This is a deeply ingrained institution. So no amount of reform is basically, I think, gonna really fundamentally fix the problem. So what are the kinds of reforms going on? So I'll say two things. One, folks like Alex Vitale, colleagues studying policing, and even at the University of Chicago, we started a project where we're studying. Some cities have begun to institutionalize alternatives to policing. So alternatives to when you call 911 instead of the police, you get a response unit that isn't armed, right? There's lots of these policies actually beginning to flourish and emerge in various cities. Alex Vitale, who's a sociologist in Brooklyn, he's studying what's been going on in New Jersey, and they've instituted a completely alternative system to policing. They haven't defunded the police, but they've really limited what the police does, and he's found crime has significantly gone down through these community interventions. And it's not community policing, it's not the police at all. It's community, local level organizations, and they have a whole set of procedures to deal with local level problems. So these alternatives are working. But the second answer is we also have to think bigger, that while we're pursuing these things, we have to realize that crime, again, I'm an interminable sociologist, crime is socially produced, right? Police officials, people will tell you there's always going to be crime, so you always need police. That's just wrong. You can legislate crime away. You can look at low levels of crime in other countries, right? Look at low levels of crime in Europe even, right? So the idea that there's just always going to be this massive level of crime and you always need this heavily militarized police, I think is fundamentally wrong. And you all have to fight against that notion to the teeth, right? Because crime is socially produced. Social problems are socially produced. And we could very well begin to have a conversation at least about how to fix crime that doesn't involve throwing guns at crime. Because that's what we as a society have decided to do. We've decided to solve social problems with militarized police. And I just don't think that we've had enough conversations about how problematic that is, how expensive that is, how dangerous that is, and that maybe there's some other alternatives that, again, we need to begin to talk about and get beyond all the vitriol of, oh, you're defunding the police and you're going to have criminals running wild in the streets. That's just, ridiculous talk. It's absurd. There's serious ways to address crime that don't have to deal with just militarizing the police. And they're out there. People are talking about them. People are studying them. We just need to open up space for them. So thank you very much for your question.
Before you go, Garrett, I'm going to throw an online question in from one of our guests, Chalu. Dear speaker, I am a graduate student majoring in Chinese modern and contemporary history. What I would like to inquire about is, as a post-modernization country in Asia, the police are not only a tool for promoting social management, but also face huge financial expenses in the process of modernization in Asian countries. Does this mean that the nationalization of the police is a reality that modern countries simply have to face?
No. Anything that the state does is a choice. Maybe not in China, right? So that's a completely different ballgame. And everything I say here, I think, has to be modulated when we talk about other countries and other contexts where, it's a different situation in say, Latin America, in the Philippines, where I studied, where, there's a different set of social problems. So I don't think that we have to take it as inevitable that you need a national police. That's the most I can say without knowing too much of the situation. But I just would worry about any claim that it's a national script that you have to follow. And modernizing states have followed these scripts. When postcolonial states emerged, when they modernized, they say, well, we have to have this police force just like the United States and so on, all these scripts that they follow. I think that there's room for more creativity than that.
Great, thanks. We've got two in the room and then one more online. Go ahead.
I just want to say I'm so grateful that you're here, Professor Go. This should be mandatory curriculum, I think, for all of us. And I also want to give a shout out to the student Amira and to the students in the room who are doing such brave work, thinking through these issues and on the streets, activating and actualizing them. My question is, when I see this slide, I'm struck by how this is shocking and obvious, and how whiteness works in hiding what, for people on the front lines of this, and for the Black radical tradition, and for people who are bearing the brunt of colonialism, this is the first thing you learn about life, and how within academia, this is a radical break from the standard curriculum and what we reproduce as professors here. So how does whiteness work in hiding this for so long and for so many disciplines? And have you encountered resistance to what is incontrovertible?
Oh, that's a huge question. Thank you so much. Have I encountered resistance? I think that most people I've talked to intuit what I'm talking about. Even police officers I've talked to. They're like, we don't need all this militarized stuff in their private moments. Right? It's expensive. It's ridiculous. They love the playing soldiers, but deep down inside, we'll admit this is ridiculous. We don't need a SWAT team, send SWAT team to every time there's a suspicion of drugs, right? So I think that the militarization is something people can get their heads around. I think the resistance comes from the racial part, right? And this is a longstanding issue when you talk about policing and you criticize policing's racialized disproportionality, because the comments are always, but non-white people commit more crime. So what can you do about that, right? Which is exactly what police chiefs since the 1900s have said from the beginning. So there's a form of statistical racism that has to be contended with. And by this, I mean, the police through this, for example, this pin mapping, what that does is generate racialized data from the beginning. If you go looking for crime in neighborhoods for decades upon decades, you're going to find crime in those neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are going to be seen as crime worthy, and therefore you have to go to those neighborhoods because you assume that crime. But that's a form of statistical discrimination because the police aren't looking for crime in other neighborhoods, right? And pin mapping from the beginning is always already, as I mentioned, based upon racist assumptions. And so police chiefs from the beginning have always countered any question about racialized disproportionality, and the right wing also. It's like, well, essentially they deserve it, right? And that's just, I don't think that's tenable at all. So there's that kind of racial assumptions that I'm trying to also get us to think about and question. And I do think that it's not just about racist police. And this is the most disturbing thing about what I've learned is that, you know, racist police, so-called racist police, they don't even have to be racist to be racist and to carry out these kinds of violent acts. It's systemic, and they're pushed along by white publics who carry with them this assumption that non-white people are inherently criminal, and that they don't understand law. All of these colonial tropes, right? Which is exactly the discourse that we constructed about colonized peoples. They don't understand law, they only deserve force. This is reiterated among white publics as well, right? And it's white publics that then warrant the police to do all the things that they do. So it's not just on policing, right? I think it's deep into a kind of settler colonial mindset that is ingrained in us. And I think that has to be contended with. And that's not easy to challenge. And that's where I get the resistance, right? Because people want to say, I'm not racist. The police aren't racist. They want to deny this, and they really can't see this. It's a basic form of institutional racism, but it's a colonial institutional racism where institutions assume that if you're non-white, you have some kind of criminal tendencies. And if you're not a criminal, wow, you've succeeded, right? And so the whole discourse from top to bottom is infected with this colonial mentality. And we need to challenge that discourse on every front. And yes, I get resistance.
Good morning. You already touched upon this a little bit, but my question is two-part. Do we see like this mode of policing that you're talking about, like this colonial mode of policing being exported by or imported by states who do not have this sort of history of empire? And follow up, if they do, like, do they struggle to kind of use this mode of policing if they do not possess the same historical and social conditions that somebody like the United States or the United Kingdom possesses?
That's a great question. So it's a very complicated question. Again, I think every country is different. And again, I would urge students to really, who are interested, to really, do some work on this. I think there's not enough. One of the things that's happened is that all of these technologies and tools are deliberately being exported by enterprising police departments. So there's a lot of police chiefs that will sell out themselves as consultants. I have a student working on the New York City police officials that develop this predictive policing, and then they sort of get paid millions of dollars by the governments in Latin America who bring them in as consultants. And there's a whole military, industrial, software, technology, and complex that is exported as well. It's not, so this story that I'm telling is importing, but there's a whole circulation that requires analysis. And so I do think there's an exportation. It's driven by career interests and corporate interests. These police officials, they set up their own companies and they consult and they make lots of money selling bad criminology to these governments, and they've replaced what sociologists used to be able to do or should be able to do. And these governments are hiring, Bratton from New York, they stopped crime in the night, so let's hire them. What did they do? So there is this perverse importation going on that also I think needs to be questioned, but there's so many incentive structures for everyone to participate in that. It's hard to undo those. But like short answer, yes, that's going on, yeah.
So I have an online question from our departmental colleague, Jordana Matlin. Thank you so much for this incredible talk, Dr. Go. I am curious if you found that the institutionalization of different approaches to two kinds of citizens, those who are accepted as such and those whose racialized citizenship has always been tenuous, whether this reflected distinct de jure approaches to citizen and subject in settler colonies. In other words, can we trace some formal distinction in the colonies to differential treatments of racial minorities in the UK and US today, or is the disparate application of the boomerang effect de facto?
Is it? Okay. Jordana, first of all, thank you for listening and thank you for that incredibly complicated question. I wouldn't expect any less from you. Yeah, that's a huge question. I guess I don't understand the de facto part, like what the last part is just,
I just.
you just read it. Okay.
If she wants to post something else, then I will.
Okay. Let me just say this answer. So I do think that what policing, militarized policing, I guess underlying my argument is this idea that there's a colonial divide, citizens and subjects, which get manifest overseas in colonial empires, gets manifested in neo-imperial interventions as well, even in the so-called post-colonial period. And that citizen-subject divide is racialized, and then it kind of begins to permeate policing practices, even when everyone's supposed to be citizens. So that then there are citizens who are seen as less than, who are seen as criminal, violent, inherently violent. So you have this colonial divide that used to be official, used to be legalized, between, you're a voting subject of the American Empire or you're a Puerto Rican and Filipino. And, there's ways in which it's still official, but even the sort of the post-imperial, post-colonial period where everyone is supposedly, or lots of people are supposedly citizens, there's also a kind of divide there that emerges, and police disproportionately treat those under the abyssal line, as we might say, even if you're a citizen. Of course, it happens to immigration. There's a whole story of policing immigrants that we need to talk about as well, and militarized policing of immigrants. But there's a slippage due to race, is what I'll say. A slippage due to these longstanding racialized images that are also colonial, a slippage from citizen into subject that happens all too often, and policing violence, policing practice manifests that problematic slippage.
And Jordana replies, de facto, but by de facto, she means there's not a distinct legislative approach to citizen subject that then applied to racialized others, but your answer tells me you got what I meant. Thank you. Yeah. Please.
Hello, Professor. I'm Saneet. I'm from India. I'm a PhD student here. Thank you for your brilliant talk. I just wanted to ask, I suspect all of these points travel to former colonies as well, presently. I can tell you from my limited knowledge about policing in India that the same colonial tools and tactics that were used during British India are probably used now as well. So I guess my question would be, if every nation state has a policing problem and policing is associated with sort of nation states in general, not just former colonies or countries with colonies, but will policing exist as long as nation states exist?
Well, policing exists as long as nation states exist. Yeah, thank you. So if you want to take a step back and think about what policing is, it is to be Weberian about it, it is it's the organization endowed with the monopoly over the use of legitimate violence on domestic territory. Right? So it's part of the state. So as long as you have a state, you're going to have some kind of organization that monopolizes the means of violence. But that doesn't mean that police as we know it would have to exist. Right? There could be lots of different manifestations in which the police power, which is different from police departments, is manifest or even used. Right? You could imagine a state having a police power where it basically never uses the police because it doesn't have to. Right? That's the state that abolitionists want to get to, or at least it uses in such a minimal way. So the police power is required for any state, I'm going to argue. Right? But police departments as we know it, militarized police, racialized policing, all this doesn't have to be.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank you for your brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. I couldn't help but ignore, though, that there's sort of a capitalist undercurrent that runs through all of these impulses that you mentioned. Racialized capitalism specifically. And still, though, there's this impulse into incentivizing the forms of policing that we see today. And like when you mentioned these systems being transported, you think about globalized capitalism and all the incentives all these private companies have domestically within the US, but also globally to sort of be involved in and encourage a militarized policing. So then how then within this capitalist system society that's global and domestic can we undo these structures? And I know you said that these are sort of structural questions that you're not going to get into, but I wonder if you saw anything in your historical research. Thank you.
Thank you. How can we undo these structures? Yeah. So, yeah, I do think the story of capitalism and its requirements needs to be told here. I mean, the state, to go back to the question of the state, I mean, the police power is necessarily the state. Capitalism also requires the state. Capitalism requires the police power, right? And I personally think, I'm going to actually talk about this tomorrow at Johns Hopkins. I think that racial capitalism is a thing and that policing is an intricate part of racialized capitalism. So you're short of saying, we have to get rid of capitalism. Again, I think that there are ways in which we could imagine, well, maybe this is getting rid of capitalism. Imagine social reorganization, right? That can then create a kind of world where we don't need police. You can call that a post-capitalist world or not, but I do think that that form of social reorganization that doesn't need a police anymore would require a serious look at the way in which our economic system is created. So, again, that's why I don't believe in just police reform, but nor do I believe that you can fix everything within the existing economic system. Because the way in which capitalism works is that it generates what I would call a subproletariat, and that subproletariat is exploited and legitimated by race. And so already you have built into the system this group that then policing regulates and disciplines. And so I do think there's something intrinsic to the way in which our economic system is, let's call it capitalism, that brings about this form of policing. But I also, so I think that when we envision alternatives to policing, we also have to envision changing social organization and the economic structures that have produced the so-called problems that police is meant to solve.
And I think that's a brilliant note to end on because we are just about out of time here. So thanks to Dr. Go for a fantastic talk. Let me also thank Alice Peretti from SIS Events for her technical and logistical support, and Sola Adelaide from the Department of Global Inquiry for her logistical support in putting this event together. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, and we acknowledge our dean here, Dean Shannon. Thanks so much for joining us today and for all the students participating.